Seat 12A was just another window seat, nothing special, nothing different, just a quiet corner for a man who preferred to travel unnoticed. The early morning sunlight rested gently on the wing outside, turning the metal surface into a sheet of gold. The cabin hummed with the usual sounds of passengers settling in, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins closing, flight attendants smiling their practiced smiles. For most people on this flight, it was just another journey. For the man sitting in 12A, it was supposed to be a peaceful trip home, away from the noise of the world, away from the memories that still visited him at night. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and tried to relax, but fate had other plans. The first sign that something was wrong came as a barely noticeable shudder. Just a gentle vibration under the floor, the kind passengers usually ignore. But the man in 12A felt it instantly. Years of flying high-performance jets had sharpened his senses beyond ordinary limits. What others felt as a small tremble, he felt as a warning. His eyes snapped open. He glanced out the window, clear skies, no clouds, nothing unusual. But the vibration didn't stop. It grew, slowly, steadily, like a heartbeat rising under stress. He inhaled deeply, trying to assess it, but before he could think too long, the second sign arrived, sudden, violent turbulence. The aircraft dipped sharply, a jolt so strong that several passengers let out gasps. Drinks spilled. A suitcase somewhere popped open. A baby started crying. The man in 12A braced himself, gripping the armrest but keeping his mind calm. The aircraft shook again, this time harder. The turbulence didn't feel natural. He had flown through storms, through air pockets, through conditions that would make most passengers faint, but this felt different. It felt like the aircraft itself was struggling. People around him stiffened. A woman whispered a prayer. A teenage boy clutched the seat in front of him. An elderly man fumbled for the call button. The man in 12A heard heartbeats quicken, breaths shorten, fear rising like static in the air. He sat perfectly still, eyes sharp, analyzing every movement of the plane, every sound, every vibration. And then it happened. Alarms began to beep. Not the gentle tones of a seatbelt sign, not the polite chiming of an announcement. These were sharp, urgent cockpit alarms, sounds passengers were never supposed to hear. They cut through the cabin like electric shocks. People looked up, confused, eyes wide. The beeps continued, overlapping, rising in intensity. Something was wrong, very wrong. The man in 12A didn't panic. He felt the old instincts rising inside him, the instincts he thought he had left behind. His body straightened unconsciously, shoulders tightening, jaw locking into focus. It had been years since he last flew in the military, years since he took a fighter jet through maneuvers that pushed both machine and pilot to their limits. But training like that never leaves the blood. It sleeps quietly, waiting for a moment like this. The plane jolted again, harder, dipping to the left. A few passengers screamed. A flight attendant stumbled, catching herself against a seat before forcing a shaky smile. "Everything is okay. Please stay seated," she said, but her eyes betrayed her. She was scared, terrified, even. The man in 12A noticed the fear instantly, but he also noticed something else. She wasn't walking normally. She was rushing toward the cockpit. That wasn't standard procedure during turbulence. Something had gone very wrong up front. He unbuckled his seatbelt slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to be ready. The alarms continued. He could feel the aircraft descending, not dangerously yet, but faster than it should. He listened to the engines. The left engine sounded slightly strained. Most passengers would never detect it, but he did. His ears were trained to hear the mildest irregularities in aircraft engines. He could practically sense the imbalance in airflow. Something inside the aircraft systems wasn't functioning correctly. A child somewhere cried out for her mother. Two people began arguing in panic. A businessman clutched his laptop bag as if it could save him. The man in 12A stayed silent, eyes fixed on the front of the cabin. He waited, counted the seconds, observed every detail, and then, the flight attendant returned, fast, pale, breathing hard. She whispered something into the ear of another crew member. The second attendant gasped softly. They both looked at the cockpit door. That was the moment the man in 12A knew it. This wasn't turbulence. This was an emergency. Passengers felt the shift in energy, the tension thickening like smoke. The murmurs began. What's happening? Why are the alarms going off? Is something wrong with the pilots? The man in 12A kept his composure, but deep inside, something had awakened, a sense of duty, of responsibility. He didn't want to interfere, didn't want to step into a role he had left behind long ago, but the situation was pulling him toward it. The plane jerked again, a sudden lurch downward that made several passengers cry out. Overhead compartments rattled. A few oxygen masks swayed from their holders. The lights flickered. The man in 12A could feel the atmosphere tightening, closing in, like the air itself was holding its breath. He looked at the faces around him: fear, confusion, helplessness. People who had trusted this flight, trusted the crew, trusted the sky. He couldn't sit still anymore. Not when he felt something inside whispering that the cockpit needed help. Not when everything in him was screaming that this aircraft was in trouble. He stood up slightly, peeking over the seats, watching the front of the plane. The lead flight attendant stepped out of the cockpit, and her face told the entire story: panic, urgency, desperation. She scanned the cabin, eyes searching for something, or someone. When her eyes landed on him, something clicked. Maybe it was his calm posture. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in his expression. Or maybe, somehow, she sensed he was not an ordinary passenger. She hurried down the aisle toward him. Passengers stared, whispers rising, questions forming. She stopped beside seat 12A, breathing fast. "Sir, are you a pilot?" she asked in a trembling voice, not loudly enough for others to hear. He hesitated. The question hit him harder than he expected. He nodded slowly. "Former fighter pilot," he replied quietly. Her shoulders sagged in relief for just a second before fear rushed back. "We need help," she whispered urgently. "The captain, he's unresponsive. The co-pilot is trying, but the systems," she couldn't finish. Her voice cracked. That was enough information. The man in 12A didn't ask more. He simply stood up, tall and steady, the years of discipline returning to his body in an instant. Passengers stared as he moved into the aisle. Some thought he was going to the restroom. Others thought he was stretching his legs. Only the attendant knew the truth, that this man might be the only chance the flight had. As he walked forward, the turbulence shook the plane again, but he kept his balance perfectly, his steps firm and controlled, like a soldier moving toward battle. He approached the cockpit door, feeling memories flood his mind: checklists, emergency drills, aircraft failures, combat scenarios. He pushed them aside. Focus. That's what he needed now. Nothing else. When the cockpit door opened, he saw exactly what he feared. The captain was slumped, sideways in his seat, unconscious. The co-pilot was drenched in sweat, fighting the controls, alarms blaring around him like a chaotic symphony. Displays flashed warnings. The altimeter was dropping steadily. The plane was losing stability. It wasn't a free fall, not yet, but it was falling faster than it should. The co-pilot saw him. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice shaking. "Former military pilot," he replied calmly. "I can help." The co-pilot hesitated for only half a second before nodding desperately. "Take the right seat," he said, voice cracking with stress. The man from 12A slipped into the cockpit seat, his hands adjusting instinctively to the layout. It wasn't a fighter jet, but principles were principles. Cockpit logic was cockpit logic. The alarms continued to scream at him, but his mind filtered them out, focusing only on the critical ones. He grabbed the yoke, feeling the aircraft fight back. It was unstable, resisting control. He scanned the instruments, reading everything in seconds. The co-pilot was on the edge of breaking down, but the man in 12A radiated a calmness that spread through the cockpit like a stabilizing force. He made quick assessments: engine imbalance, autopilot disengaged, possibly a hydraulic issue. He guided the co-pilot through actions, taking partial control, balancing the descent, reducing the angle, stabilizing the wings as best as he could. For passengers, the turbulence slowly felt less violent. The dips weren't as sharp. The shaking wasn't as chaotic. They had no idea that the man from 12A was now fighting to keep them alive. Every second felt like a battle, but he didn't lose focus. He tightened his grip, adjusted the pitch, monitored the speed, controlled the roll. Sweat trickled down his neck, but his voice remained steady as he worked with the co-pilot, issuing quick commands, correcting small errors, guiding the aircraft toward recovery. In the cabin, passengers waited, terrified, unaware that a former fighter pilot was sitting in the cockpit, silently turning a disaster into a miracle. And as the aircraft slowly regained stability, as the alarms gradually quieted, as the altitude loss slowed and then leveled, one thing became clear: the man in C-12A was no ordinary traveler. He was a hero in the making. And this was only the beginning of the incredible story that would unfold in the sky. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, panic flooding her eyes in a way that no training manual could ever hide. Her steps were fast, uneven, almost stumbling as the aircraft jolted again. Passengers turned one by one, confusion spreading like a wave across the cabin. Some leaned out of their seats, others whispered anxiously, and a few simply froze, unable to process what they were seeing. Flight attendants were taught to smile through anything: turbulence, pressure drops, emergencies, but this woman wasn't smiling. She wasn't calm. She wasn't composed. She was terrified, and that alone made every passenger's heart tighten. Then her voice cut through the cabin, trembling but loud. "The captain needs assistance." The words hit the air with the force of a physical blow. Passengers gasped. Someone dropped a cup. A man whispered, "Oh my God." Others looked around, searching for answers, searching for reassurance, but there was none. This wasn't a normal announcement. This wasn't turbulence. For a captain to need assistance mid-flight, something catastrophic had happened behind that locked cockpit door. And in the middle of that rising chaos, in the middle of voices and fear and confusion, one man reacted instantly. The man in C-12A stood up the very moment he heard the words, as if an invisible switch inside him had been flipped. His body moved before his mind fully processed the situation. Years of military aviation training, handling emergencies at impossible altitudes, making split-second decisions that determined life or death, those instincts surged back like a tidal wave. He didn't hesitate. Not for a heartbeat. Not for a single breath. His seatbelt was off in one smooth motion. His feet planted firmly on the floor even as the aircraft shook again. The passengers around him watched as if witnessing something unreal, something out of a movie. To them, he had been just another quiet traveler, just another stranger reading a magazine. But now, suddenly, he was different, steady, sharp, completely unafraid. The flight attendant saw him rise, recognized something in his expression, something controlled, something trained. She didn't even need to ask who he was. She simply stepped aside and gestured for him to follow. He nodded once, his face calm but focused, then began moving down the aisle, each step filled with purpose. The cabin erupted with whispers. Who is he? Is he a doctor? What's happening? Is the pilot okay? No one had answers, and that made the silence between the questions even more terrifying. The plane rocked again, a quick drop that sent a few passengers clutching their armrests, but the man from 12A didn't lose his balance. His gait was steady, firm, controlled, even graceful in the chaos. He walked like someone who had faced worse before, someone who had looked fear in the eyes and refused to blink. Children cried. Parents tried to console them. An elderly woman whispered prayers under her breath. A teenage boy filmed on his phone until his mother snatched it away. But every pair of eyes followed the man headed toward the front. He didn't turn back. He didn't slow down. He didn't brace himself with the seats as the turbulence worsened. He simply moved forward, driven by instinct, responsibility, and something deeper, something he thought he had buried years ago when he left the cockpit of his last fighter jet. The flight attendant leading him kept glancing back, as if afraid he might disappear, as if his presence was the only thread holding her together. She spoke in a quick whisper, barely loud enough for him to hear over the roaring in the cabin. The captain collapsed. The co-pilot is trying to manage but, the alarms, the systems, she swallowed hard, unable to finish. The man didn't need more information. He could already picture it. The captain slumped, the co-pilot overwhelmed, the cockpit filled with warnings and blinking lights. He had seen enough cockpit emergencies in his life to imagine exactly what awaited him. As they approached the front, a second flight attendant stood guard near the cockpit door, pale and shaking. She looked relieved the moment she saw him approaching behind her colleague. Is he the one? She asked urgently. Yes, the first attendant replied, voice trembling. He's here to help. The man from 12A didn't waste a second. "Open the door," he said, calm but firm. Not loud, but strong. The kind of voice that belonged to someone used to making decisions at 30,000 feet while alarms screamed and seconds mattered. The attendants exchanged a quick look, fear, hope, desperation, all mixed into one heartbeat. Then one of them entered the emergency access code. The door unlocked with a heavy metallic click. As it cracked open, a blast of warning alarms and frantic radio chatter spilled into the cabin. The sound was enough to make even the flight attendants flinch. The man in 12A didn't flinch. He pushed the door wider and stepped into the cockpit. But just before he disappeared inside, he looked back over his shoulder for the briefest instant. In that moment, he saw the cabin, hundreds of faces filled with fear, hope, helplessness. And in that instant, he made a silent promise to himself. A promise that he would not let them fall. Passengers watched him vanish behind the cockpit door. The attendants shut it quickly, sealing the chaos inside from the chaos outside. A tense silence settled over the plane, broken only by crying children, whispered prayers, and the constant vibration of the turbulent sky. A man in row 18 whispered, "He looked like a soldier." Another replied, "God, I hope he knows what he's doing." A woman pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes filled with tears. A few passengers tried to get the attention of the attendants, but they were too shaken to offer explanations. No one knew what was happening behind that door. No one knew if the plane was moments away from disaster. No one knew if the man from 12A could really help. But one thing was certain, he was the only chance they had. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with tension. The alarms were louder here, painfully loud, every beep signaling a potential failure. The captain was slumped over the control column, unconscious, breathing shallowly. The co-pilot was drenched in sweat, hands shaking as he battled both the airplane and his own panic. Displays flickered dangerously. Altitude indicators were dropping too fast. Engine readings were uneven. The plane wasn't falling yet, but it was losing stability. The co-pilot glanced up when he heard movement, expecting another flight attendant, maybe someone bringing water or calling for help. But instead, he saw a tall, steady figure with sharp eyes and a calm expression, the man from 12A. "Who are you?" the co-pilot asked, voice barely holding. "Former fighter pilot," the man replied. Just 4 words, but they carried the weight of experience, discipline, and survival. Instantly, the co-pilot's fear cracked just enough to let hope slip through. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing desperately to the right seat. The man from 12A didn't need to be told twice. He lowered himself into the seat, hands instinctively moving toward the controls as if decades had not passed. The yoke shook violently under his touch. The aircraft resisted every correction. He scanned the instruments rapidly, altitude, attitude, airspeed, engine thrust, hydraulic pressure, reading everything in seconds. Old instincts surged. His focus sharpened. Time seemed to slow down. "Tell me everything." The co-pilot swallowed hard. Autopilot. Disconnected on its own. Left engine vibration. Captain collapsed. Controls stiff. Turbulence worsening. I can't hold it much longer. "You won't have to," the man said. His voice was calm, steady, commanding, and instantly grounding. He took the yoke, adjusting gently, countering the aircraft's roll. He eased the nose up, stabilized the descent rate, and gave a series of quick instructions to the co-pilot. They worked in perfect sync, one experienced, one overwhelmed but trying with everything he had. Slowly, the plane began responding. Slowly, the violent shaking reduced. Slowly, the descent steadied. And in the cabin, passengers felt the difference. Not much. Just a bit. Just enough to breathe again. Enough for hope to flicker, faint but alive. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman whispered, "Something changed." A man replied, Maybe someone helped the pilots." And somewhere, far up front, behind a door no passenger could see past, behind alarms and fear and failing machinery, a former fighter pilot who had wanted nothing more than a quiet flight home was now fighting to keep hundreds of strangers alive. His heart beat steadily. His hands were firm. His mind was clear. This was no longer a flight. This was a battle. And he was back in the cockpit where he belonged. Inside, He found the captain fainted and the co-pilot struggling with jammed controls, sweat pouring down his forehead like he was fighting the sky itself. The cockpit was a storm of flashing warnings, shrill alarms, and the harsh vibration of a machine losing stability. The aircraft was dipping dangerously, nose tilting downward, rolling slightly to the left as though being dragged by invisible hands. The man from 12A didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze. He didn't even blink. The fighter pilot instantly slid into the right seat, the place he had once spent years commanding in combat aircraft, the place he never expected to sit in again. "Let's recover this bird," he said calmly, his voice steady like steel, eyes sharp with a focus that cut through chaos. Those words alone changed the energy inside the cockpit. The co-pilot, trembling and overwhelmed just seconds earlier, felt a surge of hope simply hearing that controlled tone. The fighter pilot grabbed the yoke with his left hand, one smooth, confident motion, while his right hand moved instinctively to the throttle quadrant. He didn't need time to adjust. His body remembered everything, every checklist, every emergency drill, every maneuver taught in military training. The aircraft shuddered violently as he tried to counter the spiral, but he didn't flinch. He assessed the situation in seconds. The captain's limp body was still strapped in the left seat, head turned awkwardly, breathing shallow but alive. The co-pilot was pushing against the controls with all his strength, trying to keep the plane level, but the jam in the system made the yoke feel like a locked door. "What happened?" the fighter pilot asked without taking his eyes off the instruments, though he had already begun forming his own diagnosis. It started with turbulence, heavy turbulence. Then a vibration warning on the left engine. Autopilot disconnected on its own. Controls became stiff. Then the captain collapsed. Just collapsed. "I tried to pull us out, but," the co-pilot's voice cracked under the weight of everything happening. The fighter pilot spoke firmly. "You did well. Now breathe. We'll get through this." He tightened his grip on the yoke and applied counter pressure, feeling the metal resisting him like it had its own will. The aircraft tilted again, nose lowering. The altimeter spun downward faster. He adjusted the rudder with his feet, instinctively coordinating the movement. His eyes darted across the panels: attitude indicator, vertical speed, engine thrust levels, hydraulic pressure, control surface warning lights. Within seconds, he pieced together a clearer picture of the emergency than the co-pilot had managed in 10 minutes of panic. "Hydraulic B system is losing pressure," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. "That's why the roll feels sticky. That's why the yoke's jammed." The co-pilot blinked. "Can we still? As long as hydraulic A is alive, we can keep her in the sky," the fighter pilot answered, steady as ever. "But we have to be smart. No sudden inputs." He gently eased the yoke to the right, compensating for the leftward drag. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a tired animal refusing to move. The fighter pilot didn't force it. He coaxed it, slowly, carefully, like he was convincing the plane to trust him. Bit by bit, the deadly spiral began to soften. The nose slowly rose, just a degree at first, then another. The altimeter's freefall slowed. The co-pilot stared at the instruments in disbelief. You're stabilizing her." "Not yet," the fighter pilot corrected, a hint of dry confidence in his voice. "She's still fighting back. But she's listening now." His hands moved purposefully, adjusting trim, adjusting thrust, correcting the tilt of the wings. Every action was precise, measured, perfectly timed. The alarms were still blaring, but he filtered them out. His brain categorized every sound instantly: stall warning irrelevant, terrain alert exaggerated by the descent, hydraulic alert important but manageable for now. He focused only on what mattered. The plane shook again, harder this time, but he held the controls like an anchor in a storm. The horizon line on the display wavered, then slowly leveled. "Come on," he whispered under his breath, not pleading but commanding. "Stay with me." For a moment, the aircraft continued resisting him, like it wanted to keep falling. Then, gradually, beautifully, it responded. The vertical speed indicator slowed its plunge. The roll decreased. The spiral eased. The fighter pilot felt the shift before the instruments even confirmed it. He could sense the lift returning, the wings regaining grip, the airflow smoothing. "Good girl," he said softly, almost affectionately, as if speaking to an old fighter jet he once flew in battle. The co-pilot stared at him like he was watching a miracle unfold. "How are you doing this?" The fighter pilot didn't answer. Not because he wanted to be mysterious, but because he didn't have time for explanations. Every second counted. Every movement of the yoke had to be perfect. His eyes remained locked on the altitude and attitude indicators, reading them like second nature. Slowly, the nose lifted enough to stop the descent. They were still losing altitude, but not catastrophically. "Give me flaps 2 degrees, he instructed. The co-pilot reacted instantly, hands shaking but obedient. 2 degrees. Set. The aircraft adjusted, drag increased, stability improved marginally. The fighter pilot continued correcting the roll. "Hydraulic B pressure still dropping," the co-pilot warned. The fighter pilot remained calm. "We'll manage. We just need enough control to keep her steady." The alarms softened now, not because the crisis was over, but because the aircraft had calmed enough that fewer warnings were triggered. The fighter pilot's hands stayed perfectly still, no tremor, no hesitation, just absolute command. His breathing was steady, even though adrenaline surged through his veins like fire. He kept his composure, his posture, his focus, everything locked into the moment. He didn't look like a man helping with an emergency. He looked like a man who had taken back control of his natural environment. For a few seconds, the cockpit felt almost peaceful. The aircraft was still in danger, still damaged, still low on hydraulic power, but it was no longer spiraling toward the earth. It was no longer out of control. It was flying again. In the cabin behind them, passengers noticed the difference. The violent shaking had eased. The panicked dips had stopped. People lifted their heads, hope flickering across frightened faces. No one knew what had changed, but they felt it. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped down the side of the co-pilot's face. He exhaled shakily, watching the fighter pilot work the controls with a confidence he had never seen in commercial flying. I thought we were gone," the co-pilot whispered. "We're not gone," the fighter pilot replied. "Not today." He adjusted the engine thrust with precision, ensuring the aircraft didn't overcorrect. The slightest mistake could have sent them into another spiral. But he didn't make mistakes. Not now. Not ever when lives were at stake. "How far is the nearest airport?" he asked. The co-pilot scrambled to check the navigation display. 70 miles. "But we'll make it. But we're losing hydraulic pressure, we'll make it." The certainty in his voice was so strong, so absolute, that the co-pilot didn't argue. He simply nodded. The fighter pilot took a slow breath, feeling the entire weight of the aircraft through the yoke. He could tell when the wind shifted, when lift increased or decreased. He felt connected to the plane, as if it were an extension of his own body. The cockpit lights flickered briefly as another electrical alert flashed on the screen. The fighter pilot ignored it. It wasn't critical. He continued guiding the plane, inching it out of the deadly spiral and into a controlled flight path. The nose continued rising, stabilizing at a safer angle. The wings leveled fully. The vertical speed returned to near zero. They were flying flat again. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but safely. Alive. The co-pilot stared, mouth slightly open. You just saved us," he whispered. The fighter pilot didn't react to the praise. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, his hands steady on the controls. "We're not saved yet," he said quietly. "But we're no longer falling." In the silence that followed, broken only by the soft hum of the engines and the distant turbulence outside, a strange feeling filled the cockpit: respect. The co-pilot respected him, trusted him, believed in him entirely. And the aircraft, damaged, unstable, struggling, seemed to obey him with a loyalty it hadn't shown all flight. The fighter pilot tightened his grip slightly, preparing for the next challenge. This was only the beginning. He had recovered the aircraft from a deadly spiral. Now he had to keep it in the air long enough to land. And as the plane sliced through the turbulent sky, with hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, he whispered under his breath, not out of fear, but out of quiet determination. "I've got you. All of you." Thousands of feet still remained between the aircraft and the safety of the runway, yet every inch of sky felt like an enemy closing in. The alarms wouldn't stop screaming, flashing bright red warnings that reflected off every surface inside the cockpit, turning it into a battlefield of sound and light. Passengers in the cabin were crying, praying, holding tightly to strangers as if the simple act of touch could keep them anchored to life. But inside the cockpit, where chaos was loudest, one man remained frighteningly calm. The fighter pilot from C-12A, the unexpected savior of the day, had his hands wrapped around the trembling controls, feeling every vibration, every shudder, every protest coming from the damaged aircraft as if the machine were speaking directly to him. He knew the aircraft was wounded, its systems failing, its descent uncontrolled, its engines screaming under the stress of the spiral it had barely escaped moments earlier. He could still feel the remnants of that deadly spin tugging at the wings, threatening to pull the airplane back into doom if he loosened his focus for even a heartbeat. The co-pilot beside him was shaking, both from exhaustion and shock, his forehead dripping sweat, his breathing uneven. The fighter pilot had already taken over almost everything, yet he kept speaking calmly to the co-pilot, reassuring him, keeping him grounded with a steady voice that sounded completely out of place in the middle of such a nightmare. "Stay with me," he said, adjusting the throttle with precise movements only years of military training could create. "We're bringing these people home. One correction at a time." The radio crackled as air traffic control repeated instructions, desperation growing in every transmission. They had no idea who this new pilot was, only that he had taken command and brought an uncontrollable plane back to a survivable altitude. Controllers were clearing all runways, redirecting incoming flights, giving him absolute priority. Fire trucks and emergency teams gathered below, forming a line of hope on the ground. They didn't know that one man, who had boarded this flight as an ordinary passenger, had already become the thin line between life and death for hundreds of people. The plane dipped again. One wrong move, one overcorrection, one misjudged angle, and they would not survive the next minute. But the fighter pilot didn't let the fear touch him. Instead, he closed his eyes for a split second, remembering years of emergency drills, the sounds of alarms in military jets, the touch of controls during high-G maneuvers, the cold rush of wind across his cockpit during near-impossible recoveries. He remembered spinning at altitudes far lower than this and fighting to gain control of jets that should never have survived the damage they took. He remembered instructors shouting in his ears during training, forcing him to stay calm no matter how deadly the simulation. He remembered missions where one mistake could have cost not only his life but the lives of those flying in formation beside him. And with all those memories sharpening his instincts, he opened his eyes and re-entered the crisis with renewed control. His voice lowered, his grip tightened. The aircraft responded, not perfectly, but enough. Inch by inch, the descent stabilized. He guided the nose forward, leveling the wings, countering the drag and imbalance with delicate precision. The co-pilot whispered, "We're still too fast," but the fighter pilot already knew. He pushed the control column forward slightly, allowing the plane to lose altitude in a controlled drop while reducing airspeed. The cabin behind them erupted in screams as the aircraft tilted forward again, but the fighter pilot didn't hear them. It was only data to him, only physics, only angles and numbers that mattered. The runway appeared in sight, long, silver, shimmering through the haze of heat and engine smoke. But it wasn't close enough. Not yet. They had to descend thousands more feet, and they were approaching much too fast. He requested flaps, but only some of them responded, the rest were jammed from the earlier spiral. He didn't curse, didn't panic. He simply adjusted his approach, lowering the gear manually when the automatic system failed. The grinding noise of the landing gear struggling to lock into place vibrated through the aircraft, triggering more alarms. The co-pilot said, "It might not hold." But the fighter pilot replied with nothing more than, "It will." The ground rushed toward them with terrifying speed. Every second felt like a final decision. The fighter pilot aligned the nose with the runway's centerline, adjusting for crosswinds that tugged at the wings like invisible claws. He kept one hand on the throttle, one hand on the controls, his posture rigid but fluid, his breathing slow and perfectly measured. The engines roared, straining, trembling, vibrating through the entire frame of the aircraft. He could feel the machine's fatigue, its fear, its desperate plea for stability. And he answered it with steady guidance that only a master of the skies could give. The last 1,000 feet were the longest seconds of everyone's life on board. Some passengers were whispering prayers, some screaming, some frozen in shock. Parents hugged their children, elderly passengers clutched their seats, strangers held hands, united by a terror none of them would ever forget. A flight attendant, bracing for impact, whispered, "Who was he? Who was that man?" But no one had an answer. 500 feet. The co-pilot held his breath. The fighter pilot didn't. 200 feet. He eased the throttle back, raised the nose slightly, feeling the aircraft glide rather than fall. 100 feet. He listened to the wind, to the engines, to the vibrations under his fingertips, every sound a message, every movement a signal. He responded with the kind of instinct only thousands of hours in the air could build. 50 feet. The plane floated, almost peacefully for a moment, as if suspended between life and disaster. Then, the wheels touched down, gently, smoothly, perfectly. The entire aircraft shuddered as the wheels locked onto the asphalt, and for a moment no one breathed, not even the pilots. Then the fighter pilot engaged reverse thrust, slowing the aircraft with flawless precision, guiding it down the runway with a skill most airline pilots could only dream of. Fire trucks raced beside them, sirens blaring, lights flashing. But inside the aircraft, a different sound rose, first a gasp, then a sob, and then a tidal wave of cheers and cries and prayers of relief. The aircraft rolled to a complete stop. Silence filled the cockpit. The co-pilot's voice shook as he whispered, "You saved them. All of them." But the fighter pilot didn't answer. He simply exhaled, slow and deep, his hands finally relaxing after the most intense rescue he had ever performed. It wasn't a mission he chose, but it was one fate had placed in his lap the moment he boarded as an ordinary man in Seat 12A. When the cabin doors opened, paramedics rushed in, followed by security and shocked airline officials. Passengers were crying uncontrollably, reaching for the fighter pilot the moment they saw him. But he stepped back. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't seeking applause. He wasn't interested in being a hero. He simply nodded politely, offering a quiet smile as trembling families thanked him with all the emotion of people who had stared death in the face and been pulled back at the last moment. Reporters tried to surround him. Cameras flashed. Pilots saluted him. Airline officials desperately wanted his name, his story, his signature. But he shook his head gently and kept walking. He walked past the emergency crews, past the waiting crowds, past the countless eyes watching him with awe. His footsteps were steady, his expression calm. He looked like a man simply leaving another flight, not a man who had defeated disaster in the sky. He didn't stop until he reached the arrival hall, where the noise of the world returned to normal, phones buzzing, announcements echoing, people rushing to their next destinations. He blended into the crowd effortlessly, the way only a trained soldier could, quiet, unnoticed, unseen. Yet, around the world, his story would spread within hours. The media would call him the hero passenger. Aviation experts would analyze the landing for years. Pilots would study the descent as a textbook example of impossible skill.